Good afternoon, Eastern Washington. This is Matt Shea, and welcome to Patriot Radio, broadcasting live from the capital of free Washington, Spokane Valley, soon to be the state of liberty. And I got an update on that here in a couple of minutes, but brought to you once again by the Committee to Elect Matt Shea, Republican, and the legacy of Dr. Stan Monteith, bringing you the story behind the story in the news, behind the news. And once again, it's not about right or left. It's about right and wrong. And we need to do the hard work to implement freedom because our hope is not in man but in Jesus Christ. And we can't end in prayer. We must also move to action. And as Exodus 15:3 says, the Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Are we warriors? Are we Christians sitting in a bunker watching the armies of the evil one march by outside, destroying everyone and everything around us? Or are we actually getting out on the battlefield? And are we doing it from a position of righteousness? Are we actually living what we say we believe? Do we know what we say we believe? Or are we just taking the easy road and sitting back on the couch? And maybe we read the Bible once in a while. Maybe we pray. But we're actually not making an impact in the world, expanding the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And that's one of the great things about Liberty State, in my opinion. Because everywhere the Liberty State flag is going to fly, and by the way, we just got the proof ordered for it. It should be coming in here in about a week or two, and we're going to get these up online. We do have the Liberty State stickers ordered. These are for your business window, your car, whatever you want to put it on. But it's the Liberty State flag. And anywhere that flag is placed, even if there's not a formal state, anywhere that flag is placed, that's where liberty is. That's where the Spirit of God is. That's where the kingdom has been claimed and expanded for Jesus Christ. That's what I love about it. It's something tangible. You can put it on the window of your business or your car. You can put the flag up outside your business or your home. And you have just claimed that ground for liberty. I love it. And that's a tangible, visible thing, not just a conversation starter, but a tangible, visible thing. It is impacting the culture around us. The motto is liberty founded in truth. Truth, obviously, being Jesus Christ. Because why did Jesus come into the world? He actually answered that question. He came into the world to testify to the truth. And the Liberty State flag is unique in that it has a gigantic osprey on it, symbol of freedom, but also a bird that is really indigenous to this part of the Northwest. Also has 3 stars: resiliency, opportunity, and rule of law. That's what those 3 stars stand for. Has a little nod to our wheat fields on each side. Has the broken shackles of oppression, a broken sword to acknowledge the sacrifices of those who helped to make Liberty State a reality, and also the blue field in the background. Truth, loyalty, purity. So there's a lot of symbolism there. And again, this is one way we can expand the kingdom of Jesus Christ. It's one way we can do it with a visible symbol. It's one way we can show people that we really do believe these things. And this ground, the place we stand, if nowhere else in the United States, this place is for freedom and liberty, especially for our posterity. And now your daily intelligence briefing on the international front in the Middle East. Kurdish independence vote coming up next week and have profound implications. The history is that's the area of where the Medes were when you hear about the Medo-Persian Empire. I read about that in Scripture as well. But the Kurds are not only in Syria, in Iraq, in the northern parts, they're also in part of northern Iran and in Turkey. So if one part gains independence, the other parts are going to want to join it. And obviously that just reshapes the Middle East. Now, a lot of people don't know that the Kurdish people are Sunni Muslim, but they're so ethnically diverse that they actually keep a distance from other Sunnis. So they see themselves as kind of a separate people. Now, there is socialist influence in Kurdistan. Unfortunately, some flags, I think there was an Antifa flag actually that one of the social media sites showed being flown in Kurdistan. So it's going to be interesting to watch what happens here shortly, because you have a lot of things also boiling up in Syria where U.S.-backed Syrian coalition forces face destruction. And now pro-Iranian Iraqi forces are crossing into Syria as well. And this is coming to us from Debka Files. So you have a lot of things happening. And all these different groups, eventually one is going to rise to the top. And maybe that's the Kurds. I don't know. Also on the international front, North Korea. Bizarre response by the North Korean leader to Trump. Quote, this is coming from the Washington Post. I will surely and definitely tame the mentally deranged U.S. dotard with fire. I didn't know he even knew the word dotard. But anyway. Donald Trump signed an executive order today. And that executive order is essentially extending sanctions to other countries that are supporting North Korea. So the practical effect of this is that while these are, I guess, ostensibly new sanctions on North Korea, it really is targeting any individual or entity that conducts trade in goods, services, or technology with North Korea. So that being China and a little bit Russia, too. So it seems like the economic war is continuing to heat up, and economic wars, unfortunately, can turn into shooting wars very quickly. Also want to mention that this missile test that he did, 3,700 kilometers, he was ranging Guam. And there's so many in the media that are not really talking about it. He was ranging Guam. He wanted to show that he could fire it that far. So all these people out there kind of poo-pooing some of this stuff, you got to go with the facts on the ground and the experts on the ground. And it'll be interesting to see what the North Korean regime will do now as a response to what Trump spoke in the United Nations, but more importantly, what he signed today as an executive order. Also on the international front, Venezuela, civil unrest, now attempting to ditch the dollar in its oil trading. Some saying that this might be a reason that deep state operatives inside the government would push for war with Venezuela. Now, Venezuelan opposition has been eerily silent, so I don't know if it's because they're going into the winter and maybe next spring they'll come out. I don't know, but because it's so close to the United States, I think it's important to keep our eyes on it, but more importantly, it's important to understand that some people may want to see war in Venezuela. And Rand Paul, I want to give some kudos to, because he actually stood up and called the Senate to task the other day on not taking back the power that the Congress rightly has to declare war and to have a debate instead of allowing these continual conflicts without really a lot of congressional, not only oversight, but a lot of congressional debate over it in a formal declaration of war according to the Constitution. And he called them to task, and I give him kudos for that, because I think this is a big deal that we don't declare war. We don't have this national debate, settle the issue, declare war, not declare war, either way, and everybody's on the same sheet of music. I remember saying when I was in the military, you go overseas, and half the country's rooting for you, half the country's rooting against you. It's just a terrible place to be. When you have a formal declaration of war from Congress, that issue's settled. And I think it's something we need to get back to. On the national front, Planned Parenthood in Missouri, probably doing one of the most honest things it's done, teaming up with the Satanic Temple. You heard that right. And coming to us from Charisma Magazine Online. But here's the important part about this. The quote in this article about someone not being able to fulfill their religious beliefs to abort a baby is alarming, especially since there have been allegations. I mean, there used to be investigative units of satanic crimes involving ritual sacrifices, not just of animals either, but of human beings. So the fact that this is said, it's kind of this bold step forward. But if any of you out there questioned the motives of Planned Parenthood, just go back and look at history. Margaret Sanger, but if any of you question the motives of Planned Parenthood, this is alarming. Also on the national front, Puerto Rico, again hammered, now this time with a direct hit from Hurricane Maria. Completely devastated. There was one, I got to read this. This is incredible. There was one weather instrument measurement station that reported, and they obviously think this was broken, okay? 67 inches of rain in 1 hour. There was another one that reported 40 inches, and there's another one, the same one actually that had 67, reported a total of 90-something. It's unbelievable amounts of rain. It's taller than a human being. And trees gone, power totally out across the island, 3.4 million people without power, and some estimates that power is not going to be restored for months. Now, I want to highlight this for a very important lesson for all of us. This is America. This is an American territory, and you have the potential of power being out for months, okay? That should be a lesson to all of us that it could happen here. And in fact, in Spokane, in this area, in Patriot Radio Land, it did happen for a little while, 10 days, 250,000 people without power. So this can happen, and it might not just be 3 days or something like that. I recommend that at a very minimum, people store up at least a month of food and water. And typically, if you have a month, you want to double that anyways, because your friends and your neighbors and your family members that are not prepared can come to you asking for help. So you want to be ready to help them as a Christian. So be prepared for something longer than 3 days. And what's happening in Puerto Rico right now, I think, dramatically highlights the reason why. Imagine a world without power. You don't have power to refrigerate. You don't have power for air conditioning. You don't have power for light. You don't have power for hospitals and the machinery that is associated with hospitals. You don't have power for pumping gas out of gas tanks. And, this is something we've been actually talking about in the legislature, is incentivizing fuel stations around Washington State. It should be all businesses, honestly, but fuel stations very particularly, to incentivize them maybe a tax reduction to do this, to install generators at the gas stations, because if the power goes out, people won't be able to pump gas. And that actually happened here in Spokane Valley a few nights ago. There was a tremendous power surge from that power line going out over the freeway of I-90 that blocked, they had to shut I-90 down in both directions for a long time to repair it. But the power surge that resulted from that took down a lot of gas stations, and people couldn't pump gas. So I think it's good to have backup generators at every single gas station, and a lot of them don't, folks. A lot of them don't. Also on the national front, Bernie Sanders coming back with his magical unicorn of single-payer health care. You know, a lot of people predicted years ago that the whole reason for Obamacare was to set up Obamacare to fail so there'd be a single-payer system. More government is not the answer. Bureaucrats are not the answer. Every time money touches hands throughout the whole system, it costs more money. And so when you have this centralized system, it's just going to be even more expensive because you have more government bureaucrats to pay for. The money is handled many more times. Not to mention, it's not freedom. It's not a free market. And where you truly do have a free market, like this hospital in Oklahoma that we've talked about on the show before, you have cheaper prices, more people can afford it, it's predictable, you have lower reinfection rates, and the employees at the hospital are happier. There's less turnover. We need to get back to that. I mean, 40 years ago, doctors used to do house calls. Imagine that today. Also on the national front, Equifax hacked back in March. They didn't tell anybody until now. 143 million people potentially exposed. But even more interesting on this kind of hacking front, the Navy has launched an investigation into whether there was a breach of its systems that may have resulted in the collisions that we've been talking about in the Pacific. So the Navy's actually launched a formal investigation to see if a cyber attack may have caused those collisions. And I actually been communicating with a cybersecurity expert here over the last few days and talking to him about businesses. Because right now, a lot of businesses don't have cybersecurity up to where it should be. And they're under the impression they actually are secure. And part of that is because audits are not made public and system specifications, you're not getting into exact things, but just standards are not revealed either. And this is going to continue to become a big deal because the next story, even more alarming than that, is that hackers got control, they gained access to the U.S. power grid controls, literally to the extent they could have caused blackouts at will. And this comes to us from Wired.com. Now, people are saying it was most likely the Russians. Either way, the fact that our power grid, with the modernization that has happened with it, is so vulnerable now to attack. And people have said, it can never be hacked and taken down. Well, Symantec, who's quoted in this article, very well-respected cybersecurity firm, is saying, yeah, this is exactly what happened. So we need to take this stuff seriously. Also on the national front, flying cars by 2020. So we've been talking about automated cars in 2 years and drones landing in your front yard in 2 years delivering packages. Now, flying cars by 2020. Also on the national front, I want to highlight the group Redneck Revolt in our Exposing the Left segment. Redneck Revolt, they're armed, coming to rallies with the intent of giving local elected officials the ability to say, well, both the left and the right are showing up with guns. We're going to ban them all. You ban guns at these rallies. And showing up even in North Idaho, Redneck Revolt is. But it doesn't sound like it's a leftist group, but it is indeed a leftist group. And yes, a listener just texted me, Bernie Sanders is all about unicorns and Skittles with his single-payer system. Brutal. Anyway, I want to talk about now the Bundy trial on the regional front. And the reason I do is because Dan Love, the head BLM agent in charge, he's the agent in charge, was fired. Now, this is after there was a refusal to prosecute him after an investigation found impropriety, particularly involving evidence that had been mishandled. Now, Raul Labrador has weighed in on this whole Bundy trial issue and sent a letter asking Sessions to reconsider. In addition to that, 53 former and current Idaho representatives, under the leadership of Representative Dorothy Moon, great friend of mine, have sent a letter to Sessions saying, hey, why are you trying these guys a third time? Back off this whole thing. And this is in addition to continuing to pursue the pardon that a lot of legislators throughout the West are doing right now as well. Also on the regional front, Joe Robertson has been released. The man who did the horrific sin of building a pond in Montana. Unbelievable. Released, and he does not look in good health, so your prayers for him and his family are much needed. Also on the regional front, this coming out of Washington State, the Building Industry Association of Washington has done a study, and that study has revealed that the Hurst decision, this is the decision that essentially has resulted in a moratorium and well drilling throughout Washington. This study by BIAW estimates that 6.9 billion with a B lost economic activity each year as a result of the Hurst decision. So an estimated $6.9 billion lost in economic activity because of this ridiculous decision by the Washington State Supreme Court. Locally, in a few weeks, we're going to learn how many parcels have been devalued by the property assessor here in Spokane County and how much money they have been devalued by. So that's going to give us a quantifiable number. Now, I already have this number, but we're not going to break it out of respect for some folks that have given us this information for a couple of weeks. But we're going to learn about it. But this study by BIAW is public, $6.9 billion in lost economic activity, and that's just the start because of this ridiculous Hurst decision. Also, and you know, this is why we need to pay attention to land use regulations, and that's why we're bringing my guest on here in about 3 minutes. On the local front, county commissioner appointment goes to the governor. A lot of people out there don't understand, you know, Josh Kearns, I give him a lot of credit for standing strong and saying, hey, look, Rob Chase is by far, he was the number one PCO pick, by far the most qualified. He should be selected and stand by his guns. A lot of people misunderstand that they think the governor can just choose anybody. No, the governor has to choose one of the three PCO picks. That's according to the Washington State Constitution, Article 2, Section 15. You can go look it up yourself if you want to. But if you want to contact the governor's office, I posted this up on my Facebook page, and I'm sharing it on Patriot Radio's Facebook page right now as well. But if you want to weigh in on this, it's really simple. You can email the governor's office, this is the person that's actually in charge of compiling all of the comments on this commissioner appointment. Keith Swenson, so it's Keith.Swenson, that's Swenson. And I will have that posted here momentarily. And when it is up there, you can just click on it and copy and paste. But if you can't, you're just writing it down right now. It's Keith.Swenson, Swenson, at gov.wa.gov. Gov.wa.gov. Okay? So weigh in, tell people who you would like. I think very clearly Rob Chase is the most qualified. Also on the local front, October 12th, we have our annual Freedom Rally fundraiser at Tretzy Farm Winery, 6 o'clock. If you want to join us, you can go to voteshay.com, contact me, matt@voteshay.com. Let me know you want to go. We're going to be posting an Eventbrite site here by Monday, and you can sign up, and we look forward to seeing everybody at the fundraiser. It's always a great time for people to just share stories and fellowship, and also you're going to be able to see the very first Liberty State flag. We're going to have it there, a gigantic one, and you'll have a chance to take a look at it and also maybe get a few Liberty State stickers to spread the word. Lastly, on the local front, Valley City Council fundraiser. This is Ed Pace, Mike Munch, Caleb Collier at La Bella V on September 28th. It's next week at 6:30 p.m. September 28th, 6:30 p.m. La Bella V Event Center out here in Spokane Valley, just off of Barker Road. And look forward to seeing everyone there. And that's the briefing. Remember, the antidote to dependency and socialism is to be a God-fearing, self-reliant, freedom-loving American. Thank you very much to everyone who's been praying for the show, for me, for Victoria, for all of our friends and family that are involved in this. And if you get a chance, go to Facebook/Patriot Radio US. Like the page, share it with your friends and family, and we're continuing to steadily gain followers and really appreciate all the help everyone out there is giving us. And if you want to support the show, you can go to voteshay.com. You can give to the campaign and keep us on the air and keep this message broadcast throughout all of eastern Washington, North Idaho, and Northeast Oregon, with very few exceptions. Well, it's my honor to introduce today Ed Kilduff. And I love the name of the organization that he is president of. It's Common Sense Alliance, and they were formed as a grassroots organization in 2009 to inform the community about San Juan County's proposals regarding land use regulations that affect the not only the community but the economy and everything else. And Ed has been a property owner on Lopez Island out there since 1998 and an environmental consultant for over 20 years. So, Ed, thanks very much for joining me on Patriot Radio today.
It's great to be here, Matt. Thank you very much.
Well, Ed, tell us a little bit about the organization. Some people probably haven't heard of you in Patriot Radio land, so just let us know what you're all about.
Sure. Well, Common Sense Alliance was formed mainly in response to the county's Critical Areas Ordinance and Growth Management Act rules and regulations. And, our slogan is community, economy, and environment. So we are for common sense in all those three areas. And, we basically were formed to fight the extremism we were seeing against property rights owners. And we think property rights are civil rights. And so we were fighting basically for everybody's civil rights.
I like the way you say that because it's really true. You don't really have any other rights if you don't have property rights. And I know the Founding Fathers talked about that quite a bit, but let's get into some details about what's going on in the San Juans. I mean, what are you guys facing over there? Because a lot of times we're just, we think over here in, eastern Washington, it's about cattle and farmland and everything else, but there's a lot of land use regulations and fights over land use regulations that are happening in your neck of the woods. If you could describe a few of them and some of the more egregious things that have happened in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, well, aside from San Juan County, I'm very involved in activities in Whatcom County, so in all of kind of northwest Washington. And the 800-pound gorilla in the room right now when it comes to anything to do with environment is the Hurst decision and water use, which is a statewide issue, but that came out of Whatcom County, where I have a lot of friends and where I do a lot of work as well. And, there's no getting around it. That is the court decision that pulled water issues into the Growth Management Act. So all these things in some way or another are related to the Growth Management Act, and the Hurst decision pulled water issues into the GMA. And that's just another way to, literally strangle people economically and, almost literally. Keep them from having water. So that's the big issue right now. It hasn't affected San Juan County per se too much just yet because we don't have perennial streams which are closed, but certainly it affects Skagit and affects Whatcom and our neighboring counties.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that they've been doing. One of the hammers that they have is the use of eminent domain and also functionally disallowing use of property. In other words, depriving you of the use of property or decreasing the property value without compensating you for it in any way, shape, or form. If you can, give a few examples of what's going on in that regard and also what you guys have been doing to fight back.
So we actually brought a suit against our critical areas ordinance, and we were prepared to take that all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And we thought we had a very good case, and exactly the point that you're making. Essentially, our case was, when does a regulatory takings, which are allowed, become a physical takings, which is eminent domain, where they owe you just compensation? And this is an issue which PLF has been trying to fight and try to get interest from the U.S. Supreme Court on. And we thought we had a very good case for our situation, and unfortunately, our case went to the Supreme Court, or went to for our writ of certiorari. We petitioned for the Supreme Court right before Scalia died, and Scalia was one of the people who had showed an interest, as well as Clarence Thomas, in trying to explore this concept of when a regulatory takings becomes a physical takings. So when our regulation is so strong that it amounts to the government taking your property without actually taking your property, when do they owe you compensation for it? That's a really sort of interesting legal question. I'm not a lawyer. But I know that Clarence Thomas and other people are really interested in that question, and we're just waiting for the right case to go up to the U.S. Supreme Court to kind of take a look at that a little bit better. And thank God we got Gorsuch on there, and maybe we will get the right case. Just one more thing about that. I don't want to sort of be long-winded about it too much, but there was a case just recently in Wisconsin which kind of paralleled our case. It was I think it was Muir versus Wisconsin, where a family on a lake in Wisconsin essentially had one of their family lots, taken from them through regulatory oversight, and they argued that it was a physical takings. Now, that case was argued prior to Gorsuch coming on, and unfortunately it did not go the way I would have liked. I thought it was a terrible decision, and in that decision, Justice Roberts said he doesn't know what property rights mean anymore after the Muir decision. So hopefully that's the high water mark for this regulatory takings versus physical takings, and we can begin to roll it back, and the government will owe us compensation for some of the draconian regulations it passed.
So, some of these ways that they do this are pretty insidious. Can you give some examples of ways that they do regulatory taking? I mean, what types of rules do they use? What type of land use regulations do they use specifically to take people's property? Or at least, over here in eastern Washington, we've had agencies that say, you've got to put a fence up. And essentially, when they put the fence up around the creek and have a setback, you lose acres and acres of land. So how does it happen over there in the San Juans?
Yeah, similar kinds of ways. One of the ways that I think is I hate most personally is they will define certain areas as being critical, like wetlands, right? And then they'll want to put a buffer around the wetlands. So if you have a small wetland and you put a 50-foot, 100-foot, sometimes up to 300-foot buffer around the wetland, you've expanded by many times what the actual quote-unquote critical area is. And I personally think the GMA is really just a ruse to try to get everything defined as habitat and protect habitat. And so it's a land grab. And so I would say buffers and setbacks and those sorts of things are essentially easements without them being called easements, and that's the way I've seen as well, by protection of quote-unquote habitat, and habitat is in the eye of the beholder. So, we have tree protection zones, and wetland zones, and geologically hazardous zones, and zone after zone after zone after zone, and you have to begin to wonder what the overall planning and land use maps really mean when you have all these regulatory, which amount to overlays on top of it, which take away your ability to use your land according to what the land use regs basically say. You can't use it for residential 5 acres or residential this or residential that, because there's so many overlays on top of it that are not mentioned.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Hurst, because there was a study that came out by the Building Industry Association of Washington that says because of Hurst, it's $6.9 billion in lost economic activity. People don't realize that water has such a dramatic impact.
Yeah, this whole thing, and I say it often, so many of these environmental regulations are not about the environment at all. It's about money. It's about trying to establish permanent revenue streams for people who, want to continue developing more and more restrictions on property owners. So Hurst has nothing to do with the environment, although that's the way it's positioned. And the short 30-second summary about Hurst is that long ago, back in the 80s, the in-stream flow rule was passed, and that rule essentially gave water rights to streams. And a series of other decisions, Postuma, Swinomish, Foster, all basically amount to the fact that you can't take any water, even if it's got a theoretical effect on a stream. You can't take any water out of the ground unless you can prove that there's no effect on any closed stream anywhere. And it's essentially impossible to do, and that's what Hurst has done. So people who may have put in wells on their property but not use them are, their property is essentially worthless. And it's horrible. It's ruining people. And it has a dramatic effect. This is the kind of interesting part. When we mentioned this to some folks across the aisle in Olympia, that you realize that property values are going to go way down, and then property tax revenue is going to go down, and that's going to impact education, right? Sure.
There's kind of a quizzical look on their face when we asked them that.
Well, I know the same thing happened in Whatcom County, where the assessor has wanted to reflect the reduction in value because of Hurst on rural properties, which would amount to a tax burden shift from rural properties to essentially Bellingham and the urban areas, and everybody's surprised by that. It's like, wow, do you really expect people who have now worthless property continue to pay your taxes? So it's kind of unbelievable how the dots are not connected in many people's minds.
So let's talk, too, about the Growth Management Act. That's kind of one of the huge underpinnings, obviously, of land use regulation and caused so many problems all over the state of Washington, from just the ability, getting back to the education issue, getting the ability of schools to actually build, because their property is outside the urban growth area. They can't build their schools. And what are some presumptions and generalizations in the Growth Management Act that you guys are seeing in the San Juans right now that would apply, I guess, to probably the rest of the state? Whether it's in regards to science or it's in regards to just how those regulations actually are going to be borne out, that people need to know about. And you can go into detail and explain to the listeners a little bit about that, because some folks I don't think are aware of what actually is happening out there as far as those presumptions and generalizations in growth management are concerned.
Well, the first thing the Growth Management Act really should be named the Rural Growth Management Act, because it doesn't seem to stop growth at all. Seattle, I think, is the fastest growing city in the U.S., not doing anything to stop growth in Seattle. So if they really want to stop growth, they know where to do it. But it's killing local communities, just killing them. And I had a friend who kind of pointed out that you don't actually need to make anything illegal in rural communities to kill them. All you've got to do is sort of gum things up. So, for instance, say a town's, because rural communities are kind of undiversified, they may have just a mill, or they may have some fishing or some sort of resource-based economy. So if a town, for instance, has a mill, all you got to do is put in, new permit requirements for the mill, and then the delays to get the permit may take a while, and you've disrupted the supply to the mill. And the mill goes under, and then everything else goes under. So you don't have to actually make anything illegal. You just have to gum it up. And that's what the Growth Management Act does. It gums up everything for rural economies, and the rural economy is unraveling. And that's what you're seeing in the BIAW when it comes to Hurst. The rural economy is just getting killed. And the urban economies are doing just great. And the Growth Management Act is essentially trying to, put a giant rural buffer around Seattle. And I think 50% of the people in the state, you drew a circle around King County and Pierce County. I think it's maybe just Pierce and King County, but basically Pierce, King, and Snohomish County for sure. There are more people that live in those three counties than live in the entire rest of the state combined. And so the Growth Management Act is essentially to make everything else in the state a buffer and a wildlife preserve for Pierce, King, and Snohomish County. In terms of science, like I say, it's not about the environment at all. So every imaginable kind of junk science gets thrown into the Growth Management Act, and these boards, the Growth Management Board or the Shoreline Steering Board and all these other things, is to uphold them, because these are political compliance boards and not science compliance boards. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of my view of the Growth Management Act. It's nothing to do with the environment. It has everything to do with killing the rural economy. And these boards are, put in place to sort of help people. That's the guise when the rationale is immediately proposed, but they don't help people. They're just political compliance boards, and they decide and accept junk science all the time.
Now, being a hydrogeologist and also an engineering geologist, I want to talk a little bit about the science behind groundwater in particular, since we have mentioned Hurst. How do they make it seem like there is a finite amount of groundwater, or at least reduce the amount that they think is available of groundwater, so that they can really exert a lot more control? What are some of the presumptions and generalizations behind that science that the listeners should be aware of?
Yeah, there's a couple of specific things. It reminds me of that saying by Milton Friedman that if you put the government in charge of the Sahara Desert, there'd be a shortage of sand within 5 years. And, who would think that Western Washington, or Washington State in general, has a water shortage? But that's what they've manufactured. So the real crux of the matter is it comes down to in-stream flows. And Department of Ecology has identified what the historical flows are in streams. And instead of setting the minimum flow for a stream at what the actual minimum is, they usually set it at the median or sometimes higher. And most of the variation in a stream isn't due to groundwater; it's due to precipitation. So when they set, a quote-unquote minimum for a stream at the median, what that means is that stream flow is met 50% of the time. And so they'll set a quote-unquote minimum at the median, which is only met 50% of the time, and then after they set the in-stream flow minimum at the median, somebody will write, some favorable plaintiff, friends of FutureWise or somebody else will write to ecologists and say, oh my God, in-stream flows are not being met in this river at 50% of the time. Well, that is exactly the way you said it. It wasn't set as a minimum. It was set as some other statistical value. So you get the situation where ecology has manufactured water shortages by making people believe that they have set minimums when in fact they have set it at some higher statistical number. And that's really what it comes down to. It's junk science in terms of setting these quote unquote minimums, which are never meant to be minimums in the first place.
So how can people fight back on this? I know you've compiled a great library of scientific resources, but people, all over Washington, have all kinds of different ideas about how to fight back. You guys have been pretty effective, and also if you can give some examples of how you've been effective in fighting back, that'd be great too.
Yeah, well, number one is to become informed and sort of understand exactly where ecology lies about these things and where your public officials are lying, to turn out and to use all the resources that are available to you to kind of understand and expose this information. So if you can blog, write blogs. If you can use the Public Records Act to get information and expose your public officials and the lies that they're saying, do that. So basically, it's sunlight. You do whatever you can to sort of daylight the issues and talk about the issues and learn about the issues, and do your best to expose the truth.
What has your success rate been in the court system? I know you've really tried to take that approach, but a lot of times you got to plan, at least in Washington State, to go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court to get any justice. What has your success been, and what are the various types of cases, at least you've either been directly involved with or maybe indirectly involved with?
Yeah, I tend to use the courts quite a lot, and there are kind of a couple of different strategies that you might use with the courts. One is to go out and actually overturn something, and to win purely on the basis of wanting to change law. That's really hard in Washington State when you're arguing from our perspective, because the courts are just stacked against you. You can, however, use the courts in ways that I was just mentioning. You can use the courts for the purpose of doing discovery and finding out the truth, and deposing people, and much in the way, say, that Glenn Morgan is doing with the PDC. You can use the courts, and you can use the processes that are that are at your that are your right to expose the truth. And so, given the way the courts are in Washington State, if you simply try to argue things from the perspective of I'm going to change the law, it's very hard. If you use the courts in Washington State to expose the truth and depose people and public officials who are lying to you, it's much more effective, and then use that information to tell the story to the public. So I think we have to maybe become a little bit more realistic about what the courts can do for us and what they can't. But using them, along with the Public Records Act, to expose the truth has been the most fruitful way that we've used.
I completely agree. Once you shine light in a place, it's pretty amazing to watch what cockroaches begin to scatter. But I do want to bring up just kind of more of a practical application of things. Somebody gets a letter in the mail. Let's say they get a letter from an agency like, Department of Ecology or somebody else, even maybe at the local level. You can no longer use that part of your property, or you must do this, and this to come into compliance with your property. What would you recommend they do at that moment?
The first thought is call Larry. I have encountered some ecology officials who send out very official looking, and yet not really official notices of violation. They're not really notices of violation. They look for all the world like notices of violation or some other threatening letter, and they have no authority to do that. So, and when we have challenged ecology officials on some of these statements, they say, well, of course, I wanted to scare them. I wanted them to stop whatever they were doing. So it's purely scare tactics. So the first thing I would do would be to read it carefully and make sure that it really is, that whoever's writing to you actually has the authority to do whatever it is they say they're doing. Many times they do not. And sometimes you have to consult a lawyer in order to find that out. So that would be the first thing. And then if you've gotten a letter like that, I'm sure your neighbors have gotten a letter like that too. So try to reach out and find other people who have dealt with this situation already, because divide and conquer is certainly a strategy of the regulating agencies and executive agencies. And the more you can talk to other people who've already been through it or are going through it as well, there's strength in numbers.
So let's say that the agency at that point, you figure out, hey, they don't have the authority to send a letter out like that. What do you do next?
Well, you can ignore it. I mean, for me, the thing that I like to do is use the Public Records Act and other methods to try to understand what the hell's going on with the agency. What are they doing? And why are they picking on you? What is the agenda that's being followed? Normally, or usually what you'll find is that there's some, nonprofit, FutureWise, or somebody else who is kind of affecting policy, which is influencing ecology's behavior. And so you kind of got to understand the larger framework of things and not be so focused on what you're doing and whether your stuff is wrong, but on, what is the actual agenda and game being played here. And that helps you sort of map out what an effective response is.
Do you find that the agencies, they'll send something out like that, will actually follow the correct processes under the Administrative Procedures Act? And it's kind of a softball question because I know the answer to it.
Exactly. No, they won't. A lot of these things are just not official at all. They're not, done correctly. They're just, they're just baloney. They're just complete baloney. So, don't. Just kind of really run it down and make sure that, try to find out exactly what's going on with your situation and find out everything that they've done that they didn't do correctly. They, as you say, they almost never do anything correctly.
Yeah, almost never follow their own rules or procedures.
Right.
So if people want to get more information about what you're doing and maybe visit the site, take a look at your wonderful library you have, it's very well done. Where can they go and how can they get a hold of you to ask questions as well?
Yeah, well, you can always just Google the Common Sense Alliance, San Juan County, and the website will pop up and there's contact information there, and always happy to talk to people. And as I say, the more everybody talks to one another and the more we work together, the better.
And in the last couple minutes that we have, I always ask guests about a message specifically directed at youth. What if you had, because we have a lot of young people that are listening to Patriot Radio throughout Eastern Washington and North Idaho and Northeast Oregon, what would be your message to them, especially about the principles behind property rights?
Don't let anybody try to convince you that you have to ask permission for everything you do in life, especially on your own property. I mean, it's just kind of amazing to me how everybody has been conditioned to believe that you need to ask somebody's permission to do anything on your property. That is weird. You know, that's wrong. That's a late 20th century, construct. And I really believe, I've come to believe that planning and all this other stuff is, I sound like a kook when I say this, anti-American. You know, I think it's just crazy. And so anyway, believe in liberty, fight for liberty, and, really believe that private property really does mean private property. It's yours. You should be able to do what you want with it.
Ed, I don't think you sound like a kook at all. That's exactly what freedom is all about. I mean, we hear all the time that we need to share the wealth, but really, if you can't use property and you can't develop property and you can't truly own property, you have a loss of assets and a loss of capital, and capital being defined as the means of production. In all of society, there's a huge ripple effect out from there. And I think that a lot of young people, especially that may, be more attracted to Bernie Sanders, kind of miss the math of all of that.
Yeah, I mean, when you look across, there are sort of studies done by think tanks and things like that which rank, the quality of freedom in various countries. And you can talk about Nobel Prize winners in economics or, these studies that are done, but, everywhere freedom is alive and well. You have strong contract rights and strong private property rights. You just do. And everywhere where you don't have those two things, you essentially have mayhem. There's a Facebook meme going around, and it said something like, socialism always begins with wanting to give. It was talking about Venezuela. Socialism always begins with wanting to give free health care to everybody, and it ends up with, everybody eating rabbits because that's the only thing they've got left, which is essentially what's happened in Venezuela. So these very sort of seductive things about sort of wanting the government to give away something free is the sort of short end of the wedge, or whatever you call it, small end of the wedge, and freedom is absolutely the way to go. I just want to say one more thing. At the Ocean Shores Conference this year, a great speech, gosh, the fellow's name is just slipping my mind. He's a very famous writer for the National Review. But what he was saying was that that poverty and misery is sort of the base default condition for people, and the only thing that has ever improved the lot of people's lives beyond sort of misery and suffering has been capitalism and private property, and people can argue all day long that capitalism is wrong, but it's the only thing that has ever improved people's lives in all of history.
Amen. I couldn't agree more with that. Ed Kilduff, president of the Common Sense Alliance out in the San Juan Islands, thank you very much for joining me on Patriot Radio today. I'd love to have you on back again, and especially as some of the court cases and some of the other things continue to develop. I think the listeners, would really value hearing what's happening over there and how that might impact them back here at home in Eastern Washington.
Happy to be on anytime. Thank you very much.
All right, and I just posted up on Patriot Radio's Facebook page. You can actually go check it out yourself. It's very simple. It's Common Sense Alliance. I mean, probably almost should be uncommon sense in this day and age, but www.commonsensealliance.net, commonsensealliance.net, and they've got a wonderful library of scientific resources and everything, a shoreline master plan and all these kind of things. If you are dealing with a land use regulation situation, go check out their website, contact Ed, learn how they've been doing some of these things, and especially using the Public Records Act, because it's begun to expose some things that are akin to quotas in how fines are being levied or some of these letters are being sent out. And again, he mentioned it. And it's important to understand that sometimes they'll send a letter out and they have no authority to really do anything. They just send a threatening letter out and people don't know any better, and so they just comply. And we've got to learn that we can push back on a lot of this stuff and call them to account. And when you have one neighbor fighting an agency versus 1,000 neighbors fighting an agency, there's a world of difference. And when we band together and we call them on what they're doing and we require them to follow their own rules and procedures and how they're doing things, and we require them to actually have the authority that they might be trying to imply through a letter, we can really have a dramatic impact in pushing back against the swamp and literally draining the swamp. You want to talk about a sensitive or a critical area? It's the swamp in America right now. And people shouldn't have to look over their shoulder, law-abiding citizens, to build on their property that they've owned for years. They shouldn't have to look over their shoulder that the well they thought they could drill can't be drilled anymore, ruining their dreams, maybe even impacting their kids too. And like I started the show off with during the briefing, $6.9 billion, according to this Building Industry Association of Washington study, in lost economic activity. $6.9 billion in lost economic activity because of the Hurst decision. And as I've said before, we need to take this very seriously. You control water, you control people. And I would add a corollary to that now that the study is out. You control the economy, too, to a great extent. I mean, $6.9 billion is a tremendous amount of money. That's almost as much as the entire budget of the state of Idaho. Lost economic activity because of an activist court. So get involved, get educated, go check out commonsensealliance.net and send Ed a note. And let's start pushing back and defending freedom locally. This is Matt Shea. Thank you very much for joining me on Patriot Radio today. Remember, October 12th, the Freedom Rally fundraiser up at Trezzy Farms. May God bless all of you, and may he make this generation the greatest one.